So I'm here with Apostle John Kelly, who is the convener of ICAL. ICAL is the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. It's a great honor to have him here. I began to hear his name years ago through Prophet Jim Jorgensen, someone that we just love and respect, someone that we've been doing mission stuff with since around 2008. So we go way back with him. And I remember him speaking so highly of Apostle John Kelly. And then a friend, Pastor Walter Nestorenko, invited me to speak at a conference where Apostle John Kelly was like the headliner, and I was probably one of the day sessions. And he wasn't feeling well, and so I didn't get to meet him in person. And then he reached out to me, which was really a blessing to my heart because I have so much respect for him and what he does. And so here we are today. And so, John, would you just kind of introduce yourself and let people kind of know where you're coming from?
Sure. I think at the right now at the age of 80, I think I've gone from being so-called apostle to being a fossil within the movement. And so and uh, and I basically serve as the international convener for the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. And basically probably talk about probably my history and ministry. I believe that's what you want me to talk about today and basically in our program. But I want to welcome you into my home and into my study.
Yes, beautiful. You got all your books are on a shelf. So that's a generational gap. I've got some books on a shelf because I'm not that young, but most of my books are actually in my computer. So, but to see the books in a shelf, it's actually beautiful. And I'm a hybrid because I preach with my computer, but I still need an actual Bible. So, anyway, you were a all-state high school football player, a Golden Glove boxer, and you're from God's favorite state, New Jersey. So can you tell us a little bit about just growing up there and what you're, getting started in ministry?
Yeah, moved to from Delaware to New Jersey when I was in fourth grade. In fourth grade, I got expelled. I was in a Catholic school in Riverside, New Jersey, in fourth grade, and I was illiterate. I couldn't read or write, and I I had a, let's say, a behavioral problem, and I basically punched the teacher, and I was expelled from that school, and I had to go to the public school. And the public school had to test me while they were, and plus the fact I was a behavioral issue, and they knew I was expelled from the Catholic school. So when they tested me, I turned out to have an 87 IQ, and basically they labeled me as basically educable retarded. And but in fifth grade, and I was kind of this fat kid, and I was one of these kind of a very quiet kid, but I was the kind of kid that you didn't want to like hit me or touch me, or else I'd go off. And so uh, in fifth grade, I had this teacher, Mrs. Imhoff, and I'll never forget after being in the class for about 5 or 6 weeks, she grabbed me by the face and she looked into my face and she said, "You will not leave this classroom until you know how to read, and you will
Wow.
learn how to read." And I
Wow.
fell in love with Mrs. Imhoff. And that woman literally changed my life. And she went to my mother and she said to my mother, "I want you to take this boy to University of Penn and have him tested for IQ and to see where he really is." And she said, "They can test him without a reading test." And so my mother took me to the University of Penn, and it tested out that I had a above average IQ. So so then what happened, Mrs. Imhoff began to teach me. And the first book I ever read was The Little Red Train That Could. And to this day, I have that entire book memorized. And she took the train and she put my name on there. And she said, "This is you. This is the story of your life and what it will be." And, the little red train was, "I can, I can, I can't." And then it was, "I think I can, I think I can, I think I can." And then it was, "I can, I can, I can. I did, I did, I did," as it pulled this load up the mountain. That was the basic book back then. Now it's much more, there's a little more reading to the book. And so that was the first book I ever read. And I graduated from there, and I wound up graduating from eighth grade, magna cum laude, and gave the commencement speech at eighth grade. Also at fifth grade, my father went to my mother. My father built bridges all over America, all over the world, and he was superintendent over these high steel iron workers.
Wow.
And my father came home from a job, and this is during this whole transition with Mrs. Imhoff, and my mother was telling him the story and everything, what was going on, and he was happy. But then he said to my mother, "You're no longer raising him, I'm raising him." And so he took me down to this gym in Riverside, New Jersey called Turner's Tergamine Gym. And it was a German gym that did three things, well, four things. They taught gymnastics, boxing, and wrestling. And and then downstairs they had a bar where they did a lot of drinking. So my father got me into that gym, and he said he went there as a boy himself. And so I began to box and wrestle. And I was, like I said, this fat kid. But then by the sixth grade, I was doing bodybuilding as well as boxing, and I was winning many championships all over New Jersey and all the way up until eighth grade. Then my freshman year, we moved to Michigan. My dad built the Mackinac Straits Bridge going from the lower peninsula to the upper peninsula of Michigan. Played high school football, started varsity my freshman year there. And me and a whole bunch of kids from the construction came in, and basically that school couldn't play in their league, and they had to play all these big teams, and we were winning. And actually, a couple of us even had major college scholarships later on in life. So then my sophomore year, in the summer there, I lived on the St. Regis Indian Reservation, which is now Akwesasne. My dad built all the bridges across the St. Lawrence River. And
Wow.
then I went to high school in Ogdensburg, New York. Didn't box, didn't wrestle during that time. I just played football. Came back to New Jersey and started boxing again and playing football. In my junior year, I made all state as well as all county and all South Jersey. Same thing happened my senior year. And I was winning also many boxing championships throughout the winter and into the spring and summer, and boxed basically in almost every city in New Jersey. And then I also a year later I won the Philadelphia championship, AAU. So that's kind of like my background in that. I didn't come to faith in Christ until I was 29, and it was just a couple of weeks before I turned 30, and it was in Bordentown at the home of Joseph Bonaparte. And that's a whole other story. It's a long story. I won't get into that. But then I got involved for a brief time in the Catholic Charismatic movement. And then I wound up going to a Pentecostal church in Burlington, New Jersey. And then I went to another Pentecostal church in Burlington Township. And that was it's called Fountain of Life Center, led by Paul Graben. And he took myself and some others, and he began to disciple us into ministry. And he made us all take the Berean course, the Assembly of God course. And I did about 2 years of study. I didn't finish the program, but I picked and chose a lot of courses that they had. And that gave me a good foundation. And then about when I was about 33, I was actually 32, he laid hands on me and sent me out to begin a prison ministry. And basically, it was a ministry that began with military bases and prisons. And I felt like I was called to minister to men, and began a prison ministry called the Bridge Ministries in New Jersey. That wound up with 183 volunteers going into about 33 institutions throughout Jersey. And that was on a weekly basis, by the way. And so, and that wound up being I did that for a couple of years as that grew and developed. And I wound up speaking a lot of full gospel businessmen
Yep.
throughout Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland. And those things began to develop. And then I really felt like God was telling me to let go of the prison ministry. And I didn't know why. And at that point, I personally had probably led, at least 1,000 or more men to Christ, just men alone. And and at the same time, probably maybe 100 or so of them really, really, stayed saved,
Yep.
really walked the walk, just being honest.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so then I basically gave about 75 to 80% of that ministry to Prison Fellowship with Chuck Colson and them. And they
Wow.
did a very good job in the transition
Wow.
and a tremendous job in the Jersey institutions. And we were also by that time in Pennsylvania and New York as well. So so then I didn't know what to do. So I began traveling. Uh, I was getting invitations to speak in churches from speaking in Full Gospel Businessmen. And I began to travel as an evangelist, but also as a prophet to churches and ministries, primarily within Jersey. And then that expanded. I used to go up and down I called it the 95
Yep.
ministry, up and down
Yep.
that corridor, all the way from Maryland all the way to Maine.
Yep.
And basically ministering as a prophet and evangelist. I had a band who have traveled, and we go into churches, and I would usually give a message that was fairly prophetic to the church. And then I would basically begin to pray for people, and we'd have healing, deliverance, prophetic words. And it was great. And we would also go in trucks on flatbeds and pickup trucks and go into the projects in Jersey cities and do outreaches as well with various pastors around New Jersey. So began to do that. And then God called me to plant a church. And of course I thought, well, this is going to be great because traveling in ministry like I did, I knew everything that was wrong with church.
Yep.
I knew everything that was wrong with pastors. I had it all figured out. And then, and then I began to plant the church. And the first meeting that we had in the church, I stood up in the pulpit. And my daughter remembers this like it was yesterday, says my wife. And I called out three women in the middle of my message, told them to stand up, told them they needed to leave the church because they were Jezebels and gossips and so forth. And they left the church. And to be honest with you, from that moment on, I've never had a problem with a Jezebel in my ministry. It's almost as if they take one look at me and walk out the door. So, so the church began to struggle. It was struggling.
Yeah.
And I had people coming all the time, but I also had people leaving all the time.
Yep.
And what I discovered after about 6 to 9 months is like, I know nothing about the church. I know nothing about leading a church. That all of my summations that I had were totally erroneous because I had no idea what pastors really had to go through, what
Yep.
shepherds were really dealing with.
Yep.
And so I began to uh, become a little more pastoral in
Yeah.
my methods, and which I wasn't before in my other two types of ministries. And and as I began to be more pastoral, I began to realize what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were, and I took a radical assessment of myself
Yeah.
and realized I was strong at strategy, I was strong at leadership. These were my strengths. And so I remember announcing to the congregation that this particular man, Yed Mannering, and this woman, Nancy Foray, would be the pastors, would be the pastoral gift people of the church. People stood up and applauded. And and my back door closed and the church began to grow and expand. And I began to focus uh, not on counseling people. I can remember I was in a counseling session. This couple was talking about their marriage, and I started shaking. I thought it was the Holy Ghost, but it was the husband, and he was shaking me. And I had fallen asleep, and he was saying, wake up, in the middle of the counseling session. And the wife is going, he doesn't care. He doesn't care. And I'm thinking to myself, I really don't, because basically their whole problem is they're just not obeying the word of God. They're not living by the word of God. They're living by their flesh, by their desires. And they're both being highly self-centered. And so I began to realize, wait a minute, I definitely need some other people around me that can counsel as well as these other two. And began to raise up the post-ascension gift ministries in the church.
Yep.
I began to raise up elders in the church, pick out people that were elders, but I also focused on developing leaders. And an amazing thing is the first three men that I've ever led to Christ became leaders in that church and wound up eventually after a couple of years. And that was at one time for a season, it was the largest charismatic church in New Jersey.
Wow.
And then other churches began to spring up uh, and began to grow even larger than we were. And so,
Hmm.
but we weren't in competition. It was just a
Oh yeah.
move of God taking place,
Yes.
having to do with basically the apex of the charismatic movement.
Was this in the 70s?
Yes.
Okay.
So then what began to happen, um, as that began to take place, uh, I felt an urge to leave the church. I felt like God was saying, okay, you've raised this up. It's going good. You got good people around you. Now you can leave the church. You can hand it over. And so I told my family, I said, I'm going to be letting go of the church. And I had four different men that I felt could lead the church, either one of them, but each one of them had a certain strength. Each one of them had a certain weakness. And so what I did was I took the church and divided it into three or four other churches is what happened. And each one of them, began with over 100 to 200, maybe 300 people. And so, and
Wow.
we lost people in the transition as well.
Yeah.
So I went to New Hampshire, and in New Hampshire, uh, I met a man. I was praying up in New Hampshire about what my next move would do. And I saw a building in the road, and it said Day Spring Cathedral, and it had property of U.S. Marshals. So I went up and looked at that building, and found the door was open, and I felt like God told me to go there every morning and pray, and He would speak to me the next thing He would have me do.
Wow.
And so I didn't know if I was going to go in business. I didn't know if I was going to go in ministry, what. And basically, 7 days, 7 mornings, I prayed there and heard absolutely nothing. And as I walked out, a old beat up Jeep Willie, all with rust on it, pulled up and actually sprayed road dust all over me. And the guy pulled down the window and he said to me, uh, "What are you doing in there?" And I said, "I was praying." He said, "Are you a man of God?" I said, "Well, right now I'm trying." I'm real happy about being covered in road dust. And he began to prophesy to me, began to talk to me.
Wow.
And and um, he was basically drinking alcohol out of a paper bag as he was saying it. And for an hour and a half, he talked to me about the crossroads in a man of God's life. And at the end, he prophesied, and it dawned on me who I was speaking to. And I and be honest with you, 6 weeks later, in a motel in Jacksonville, Florida. No, excuse me, in in Jacksonville, Florida, he committed suicide. And
Whoa.
what had happened was a terrible thing that happened to him. But he had somebody that stole a lot of money from the church,
Wow.
and people blamed him and all that it was him, but it wasn't. So anyway, this he prophesied over me, and he said, God is calling you to be an apostle. So I went back and told my wife and all that what it was, and we didn't believe in apostles at that time. And so then when I got back to Jersey, I was back in Jersey for a couple of days, still praying, trying to figure out what direction I was going in, and basically the four men and plus two other men who were pastors all wanted to meet with me. So I thought this is either going to be good or bad, but I'll meet with them. And what they said was, we've been reading this book, this manual that you told us to read, from Kevin Connors on New Testament church. And in that, it lays out whole thing about fivefold ministry and elders and the bishop to set one of the church and all that. And basically, our church was patterned that way, with elders in a set one, the episcopos. And so basically, and I believed in a plurality of elders with the set one with the final word, a first among equal kind of
Yeah.
mentality.
Yeah.
So so basically, we had gotten that far in New Testament church government, but we didn't get to the point of apostles. And so they said, we believe that you're called to be our apostle. So we want to give you support. So they started giving me financial support. And meanwhile, I'm trying to find out what apostles are. Got a hold of Jim Durkin out in California and talked to Dick Iverson and a guy by the name of Dick Benjamin, had long conversations with them, had conversations with some brothers out in Toledo, Ohio, about what it is to be an apostle and all that. And out of that particular group, developed a network of churches that became Antioch churches and ministries.
Wow. Build?
And yeah, out of that group. And that Antioch churches and ministries uh, was about 100 and I think it was about 116, 120 some churches. That's what Jim Jorgensen and Joe
Yeah.
Mature and all were part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that developed. And then Peter Wagner came along and had me write a chapter in a book for him on apostolic networks and so forth, which I did. And
Wow.
then he and I were in this meeting in Singapore, and it was a big meeting with apostles, prophets. There were a lot of people there. And then there was a special dinner held at the top of this building. And there was maybe 12, 14 men there that were apostolic leaders from primarily Australia, Singapore, and the US. And there was only about 3 of us from the US in that meeting. And they got talking about the need for some kind of accountability among apostles. And
Yeah.
they started asking Peter Wagner if he would put something together. And they must have asked him at least 9 times that I think of. And he kept telling them no, he wasn't going to do it. And so the meeting ended. And then about 6 weeks later, I get a call from Peter Wagner saying, "Let's start that." And I said, "Well, I don't think its goals should just be accountability. I think it needs to have somewhat of a missional purpose to it." And he agreed. And so I'm all the time I'm thinking he's going to be the head. And so I said, I'll support you and blah blah blah. He said, "Oh, no, 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 no." You said, you'll start it. And he said, "I'll be behind you." So I said, "No, no, no." So after about a year and a half of he and I wrangling about that, I finally submitted to him because he just wore me down. And so I led it for about 2.5 years
Yep.
and and then handed it over to Peter Wagner, and he led it for 11 more years, and then he handed it back to me. And when he handed it back to me, it was 95% American. And it was called the International Coalition of Apostles. So the first thing I did was I put in the literature, you know, and I I put in kind of a byline or a
Yep.
branding that said apostolically led, prophetically influenced. And I lost probably within the first 3 to 4 months of my leadership, probably minimum 50% of the membership, maybe
Wow.
more. And but within the following 6 months, those numbers were back up to the original number. And what happened was um, leaders of larger churches and people that had emerging or establishing networks of ministers or churches and ministries began coming in. And so the other thing that began to happen, and this happened over a couple year period, was it changed from being 95% American to about 95% uh, International. And within the first 2 or 3 years, what I did was I took the US and made it a separate coalition and appointed Joe Matera as the convener of the United States Coalition of Apostolic Leaders,
Wow.
of which some of the men and women you know are part of.
Yeah.
So, and he led that, and he
Yeah.
led it well.
I have
And so,
tremendous respect for Joe Matera. Tremendous.
yep, and so then Joe led that, and and then what I did was establish coalitions in other nations, but I also took out the hierarchical structure, eliminated the vertical structure of ICAL, and made it a horizontal structure. And instead of leading from a position of authority, I would lead from basically influence and and basically not only influence, but a passion for the missional intent of Matthew 28 to make disciples that disciple nations. And so, in other words, being able to make disciples who will not only raise up churches, but that will reach various people groups in various cities, nations, territories, whatever. And so that began to develop. And so now there are 47 coalitions, national coalitions in 47 nations. We have members in 97 nations. And we also have coalitions in cities and as well. And as well. And so basically, and then every year in November, we have a global gathering, and that's at the Dallas Fort Worth Airport at the Hyatt. And they
Yeah.
fly in from Africa, Central South America. They fly in from Asia. They come from all over the world, and it's amazing. I mean, who comes? And we're talking about, and so many of them, you know, are leading, incredible churches, incredible uh, networks from Canada, Australia, Europe, Africa, Central and South America, Asia, and all those parts. And so now we've grown to probably close to 3,000 members, uh, and just constantly developing and working on that. And I just got back a little while ago from Brazil.
Brazil. Yeah, I was following
Yeah,
you.
yeah, and we had a meeting there. We had one meeting there where we had 1,700, yeah, 1,700 apostolic leaders were in this one meeting we had.
Yeah.
And then
Everything's bigger in Brazil. It's like the Texas of Latin America.
yeah, well, the apostolic movement is really, really huge in these countries. When you're talking about Central America, Africa, um, and parts of Asia, especially when you're talking about Indonesia, Malaysia, those countries, uh, and also in all throughout Africa,
Yep.
and so that's really, really where a lot of our strength is as well. So that kind of brings you up to, where I am now, and
Yep.
and kind of what I'm doing, and it's I'm just called to serve.
Yep. So as the convener of ICAL, the international branch, are you still doing a lot of traveling? Are people flying in to see you? What's the nature of what you do in this season?
That's really a good question. What's happening now is I haven't gone anywhere in probably 2.5 years, and this year I started going places again, and but basically, people are flying in and meeting me, or let's say they're going somewhere and they'll deliberately,
Yes.
hub at the Dallas Fort Worth Airport so they can spend just a couple hours with me in a restaurant or something. So
Yes.
or they'll come and be with me for a day or so. Yeah. And so I do a lot of, um, I wouldn't, s- I w- basically I do a lot of parenting. Um, at the age I am now, it's kind of interesting. People who I began to mentor, and those that out of that mentoring group that I began to disciple, and those out of that discipling group that I began to parent, uh, especially those I began to parent, something really happened. And that is that until I was in my 60s, I was kind of at the tip of the point. Hello?
Yeah.
That's where I was.
Tip of the spear.
Tip of the spear. But then what happened is the spear started changing
Yeah.
because I had spiritual sons and daughters who were starting to emerge and began to whatever I did. Like, for instance, okay, let's say, minimally, I led 1,000 men to Christ in my first couple of years of ministry. But I have spiritual sons that have led tens of thousands of men and women to Christ.
Yeah.
You know, I have a spiritual son. His group is planning over 1,000 churches a month. So uh, I may have had to had for a season, and not even a super long season, the largest charismatic church in Jersey. At the same time, I have spiritual sons that have churches anywhere from double to 70 times larger than that church. And just amazing. So now I know what it means that when the Bible talks about the first shall be last. Because now that when I began hitting my 75, I began to have many, many of them who were doing greater works than I. And I'm so fortunate to have spiritual sons and daughters who everything I've ever done, they're doing greater. And it's just a wonderful thing to experience, to see your spiritual children doing greater works. Because even as a natural parent, your desire is that your children do greater works.
Yeah.
And I believe I think that if you're, in your 70s, especially when you're my age and you don't have any spiritual sons or daughters doing greater works, you may not have really, really discipled them and really, really brought them up in the way that they should go,
Yeah.
and really, help them to develop the proper disciplines in their life.
Yeah.
And not only that, but basically, one of the things I've discovered, and this is maybe a good thing, and I know there'll be people that hear this that'll totally disagree with what I said, but I really don't care. But but basically it's this: leadership builds churches. Leadership grows churches. Now the problem is leadership has to also understand that spiritual development of the believer is the first and primary goal.
Yes.
That's the first and primary goal. When a church growth, is secondary. So in other words, the qualitative growth of the believer is always primary.
Yes.
The quantitative growth of the church is secondary.
Yes. I 100% agree. Um, I agree. First of all, I thank you so much for what you're saying, because quite honestly, in our previous conversation, when we first talked, I listened to you really carefully about people flying in to see you. And it made me think of what I would want to do when I'm older. And I really appreciated that, because I was like, in the world, it's like people get old and they fizzle out. But in the kingdom, it's the opposite. It's like there's so much value, and the blessing of the Lord is still in Isaac, in Israel, even though his eyes are dim. He
Right.
still has the power to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, even though and so I was just thinking about just what you do, and I'm really encouraged, because we want to run the race faithfully to the end. This is not a short race. This is more of a marathon than a sprint. I know that there's seasons of acceleration where there's a sprinting, But the nature of what I'm doing in this season of my life is really everything is really slow, and it's really beautiful and it's really real. So I'm pastoring a church that me and my wife planted in 2015. It's finally starting to grow. The growth is people in Christ, and slowly other things have happened from that. And my mother, she was homeschooling my children. So I was a pastor, with a free schedule. And my mother died of cancer. So I then assumed responsibility of homeschooling the children. And one of the things that I've learned in the context of teaching children is that the level of patience that I have determines how well I'm actually able to teach those that I'm teaching. So if I start to feel impatient and agitated, the connection and the ability to teach and impart what we're trying to get down is drastically hindered. And so I realized that patience is one of the things that God uses to sift us of selfish ambition so that we can build long term for the kingdom, and we're not in a rush, but we're moving in love. And the nature of love is that it's patient, and the nature of lust is it can't wait and it's in a rush and it's about numbers and ambition and all this other stuff. And that's not what this generation needs. And so I just like hearing you and hearing your journey is really inspiring to me because I just turned 40 and the Lord had spoken to me really clearly. When I was a young man, it was in 2005, and the Lord said to me, before you're 30, you're going to go to 30 nations, you're going to travel the world and preach the gospel. And at that time, I was a plumber by trade. I was making good money. My goal was to have a business, help people on my own terms, and be left alone. And when I went to Honduras for the first time in 24 in 2005, April of 2005, I saw abject poverty for the first time. I fell apart and I left the village with no shoes on, crying. People on our team thought I was crazy. And later that year, I smuggled 76 Bibles into China, and the Lord spoke to me and he said, before you're 30, you're going to go to 30 nations. So I went home, New Jersey guy like you, plumbing, working on prevailing wage state jobs. Like for a young guy, I was doing well. And the Lord, I just quit my job. Everyone thought I was crazy. And I had the apprenticeship. I was the youngest guy, like 21. I was already like 2 years almost into an apprenticeship, which was really a favorable opportunity. I was the youngest guy that had the best position for the future. And the Lord is like, I want you to lay that all down. So I said, okay, cool. So I go, he says, in November of 2005 in CIAS University in China. He says, before you're 30, you're going to go to 30 nations and travel the world. And I said, this is crazy. So I went home, quit my job, and then God began opening doors. And then I lived in Canada. I was mentored by Steve Stewart, who founded Impact Nations, which is a Christian humanitarian aid organization. And before that, he was a vineyard church planter in Canada. In fact, when Toronto broke out, he actually had the largest vineyard church in Canada. So he's a really spirit-filled, really good guy. I learned a lot from him. And then I came back, met my wife, started a ministry, traveled from really 2008 till about 2015. 2015, we planted a church. My pastor, David Greco, laid hands on us, released us into the ministry of pastoral ministry, and we've been pastoring and doing itinerant stuff since then. And so that's kind of like in a nutshell our story. And I grew up in Pastor Jason Alvarez's church. So we grew up around uh, the whole ministry and all that. And actually, my parents sold their business, and for a season, they worked for Dr. Mark Hamby. That's a long time ago, but they worked for him because he had a pastor's retreat for burned out pastors. Is a whole nother story. But yeah, I grew up. Basically, what I'm saying is, I grew up in and around the things of God, around powerful people, around seeing miracles, and so when I came into the kingdom, I didn't have any real restrictions in terms of belief system. My only issue was me. Like I remember being a 10-year-old boy, Pastor Jason Alvarez is on the keyboard, and there's a guy who's been in a wheelchair as long as we've known him. No one touches the guy. The guy pops out of the wheelchair and starts running around the church like he's like, and everyone was like, what in the world? And no one laid hands on him. Just the glory, the presence of the Lord came and the guy was literally never the same. So I grew up with that being normal, right? That was my grid. So the thing that I'm really thankful for my father and mother for is that I've never had a faith crisis in the sense of like I've never wrestled with unbelief. Like I've wrestled with myself, but I never was like, is this real? Is Jesus real? Like even when I was wicked and a sinner, I had a foundation knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is who he says he is and he does what he says he's going to do. And so for me, the struggle was, am I going to submit to that or am I going to do what I wanted? So I wrestled. I went out into the world. I'm like you. I got thrown out of school. I went to school with bars on the windows. A bunch of my friends are dead. I could have been dead a bunch of times. Um, I've baptized people that I used to run from the police with. You know, uh, we have people on our leadership team that I used to smoke weed with. And so yeah, it's a very redemptive story like yours. And it's so interesting, like how you started in prison. The first time I ever preached was in Essex County juvenile corrections facility. And the minister who got me going into Haiti had a prison ministry for 10 to 12 years. There's so many similarities in your story. And I just hope that when I'm 80, I'm as strong and as vibrant as you. But I'm really thankful for your time. And so what would you say to guys, young guys, girls starting out in the ministry, maybe 5, 10 years in? What would you say to them are some just practical keys to longevity in the kingdom?
Probably the first thing I would say is do a ruthless inventory of yourself and really discover not only your strengths and your weaknesses, but just discover like your attitudes, discover as much as you can about yourself. And and then write down all the areas that you think you need to change and begin working on that. And character is the greatest thing for us to form and to really look at how we are in that area. Then the second thing is invest in education. So many people think that going into ministry is like Peter Pan waiting for Tinkerbell to come and hit you with a wand, and all of a sudden now you're in ministry. And so I think it's important to get some kind of of an educational background, like Paul Graben, Pastor Paul Graben, that was there at Fountain of Life Center. I mean, he insisted that we take those Berean courses. He didn't tell us which ones we had to take, but he really insisted that we do that.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've done with every single disciple I've ever had is I've insisted that they take some kind of online study because and all those that I worked with or tried to work with that didn't do that never made it. Never, or they had very minimal kind of ministries.
Yeah.
And because it's not so much that uh, it's not just filling you with information and knowledge, but it's the discipline of how you have to think and learning the scriptures and trying to learn the context and the history and the culture that these things were spoken in and so forth. I think that's really important. One of the things I see, uh, I mean, I think that dispensationalists are way off theologically, but
Yep.
I do think a lot of charismatics are way off theologically as well.
Yep.
And I hear dualism, I hear Gnosticism, and
Yep.
not only that, but I hear some things that are just plain heretical. They're not even in scripture. And and so and that happens because of that lack of foundation. One thing I learned in sports, whether it was football, whether it was boxing, or whatever it was how important your footwork is, how important your foundation is. The other thing is how important your core is,
Yep.
how strong your core is. And because everything, your body has to move, and it's your core that does that. It's like when you throw a punch as a boxer, the punch that's the most powerful is not thrown by your hand, It begins with your big toe, coordinating with your knee and throwing your hip and throwing your body into that so that you're hitting them with your whole body
Yep.
primarily.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another thing. I think the other thing is important, um, of what group, what tribe, whatever you want to call it, that you get involved with, you know. And some groups are very good at teaching. Some groups are very good at affirming you and loving on you and caring for you. But but also you need to have people around you that can help you develop more in your leadership. Uh, so I think that's important. I think it's important that you discover what your lane is. You discover what it is that God is calling you for, because God is always calling you for a greater purpose than you're capable of right now.
Yeah.
And so basically it's learning to understand that the impossible is possible,
Yeah.
and how to go about that. I think it's really important too that um, we have the right mentors in our life. You know, it's like back here behind me, there's quite a few books, and over on one shelf here, there's books on a lot of study books, concordance, Bible dictionary, all these kinds of things. You know, I have all those kind of books, but I also have a whole shelf, more than a shelf of books on economics, and I have two shelves of books on leadership. I have umpteen shelves of books written by people in ministry
Yep.
and and all these things. I even have books on strategy, and I have books on other things. And I think it's really important that we basically, learn to discipline ourselves, as
Yeah.
well
Yeah. One of the
in
things
all
I've
these
always,
different areas.
yeah.
So there's some of the things that I would share.
Yeah, one of the things I've shared a lot, because our generation, when I say our generation, I'm like 40 and younger, they're not really into discipline, but they're into the fruits of discipline. And one of the things I always say to people is that discipline is supposed to get the worst out of you and the best from you.
Good.
And so like this is a really important thing. Another thing that you touched on, which is really important, I've actually been teaching about this at our church, is that your measure of faith is for your area of service. So God gives you a measure or a metron, but it's for your area. It's not for my area or someone else. So focusing on your assignment is really essential. I find that it's easy to be distracted and to focus on things or people that I'm not responsible for. And it becomes easy to neglect what I am responsible for when I'm distracted by things that I'm not responsible for. One of the things I learned early in my pastoral ministry, which I was kind of like you, I'm not really tempered as a pastor in that sense. But one of the things that I learned is that I am not responsible for people who don't respond to me. And so, sometimes you spend time chasing people and there's people there that are wanting more of what you have that God has given you, and you neglect them to chase a stray who's not even interested in some of the things that you have from the Lord. And so I learned to kind of just cut that out in a gracious way. But yeah, I don't waste time with people that don't respond to me well.
So let me add to that. You know, I always look for the seekers. I
Yep.
always look for the searchers. I always look for those that are hungry, those that have a desire. And because they're the ones that you can actually pour into, and that really, out of the many, that's really a few.
Yep.
And and the more what I've discovered, the more I pour into the few, the greater everything expands, the greater everything grows.
Yes.
Because then they begin to pour in to a few, who pour into a few, who pour into a few.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really good what you're saying. Um, I think too many times, like one of the things I noticed when I had Antioch churches and ministries, the smallest churches that were in our apostolic network at that time were where the shepherd focused on counseling all the time. Those churches were the smallest, but where they focused on developing, people into their ascension gift, into leadership, those churches were growing, those churches were developing, those churches were expanding. I think one of the other things I want to mention that's really missing in a lot of charismatic churches, that's something really simple called evangelism, you know. And
Yeah. This little thing called the gospel.
the reason why churches in Africa and churches in Central America and South America and all these places, one of the main reasons why they grow like they're growing, like Brazil, is because they have a high value and a high focus on the ministry of evangelism. And so where charismatic churches here in the United States, it's more like they want to focus on charismatic gifts, and that becomes the primary focus. And so the only growth that they have is transfer growth from another church, if that. But the problem is a
Yep.
lot of the people that focus strictly on the charismatic gifts now are in their 60s. They're in their 60s. When I'm in a church and I see a bunch of white hair, I see a church that's dying. I see a church that only has maybe 10 more years, you know, and they're going to have to shut the doors because there's not going to be many left. You have to be able to reach the youth. And the only way you're going to reach the youth is that you have to basically look how to contextualize the gospel message, you know, in order to reach them.
Yep.
And it's very important or else the churches are just going to just die out with older people.
Yeah.
And I know I'm in my 80s, but I'll tell you what, the real fruit, the real fruit is the churches I see that are growing the most have people in it from, I would say in their late teens, into their 50s. They're the churches that are growing. And they tend to have pastors that are anywhere from their mid 30s to 50 something as well.
Hmm.
And they're the ones that are growing because the way that they're thinking. And even here in the United States, I've been looking at growing churches. And the churches that are growing here do have an emphasis on evangelism. Uh, but many charismatic churches just don't have an emphasis on that.
Yeah.
And they're declaring things and they're shouting into the heaven and so forth. And it's like, and God's saying, well, what, I'm sitting on the throne here, but I'm waiting for you to do it.
Yep.
Because everything God's going to do, he's going to do through his church.
Yep.
And in other words, we have to be moved into action.
Yes. Yeah, I agreed. One of the things that we've done for the past maybe year and a half or 2 years, is every week after service, um, they are bringing groceries and praying for people on the streets.
Yeah,
So like that's basically,
that's good.
yeah, and we're in West New York. So West New York is the third most densely populated city in the United States. Manhattan is eight in terms of people per square foot. So we don't have a parking lot, we don't have a ritzy building. It's a real interesting spot, but God is moving. Um, and that is something that we felt from the Lord to really do, is to be in the community weekly. And just with the way people's schedules work, the cost of living, the pace of life, we found that on Sundays, since people are already there, then that's a great time to bring three, four, two, five, 6 bags of groceries, and literally lay hands on the sick, minister to people, pray over people. And yeah, so it's been exciting. God is we're starting to see some of the seeds that we planted starting to come into a sense of fruition, and we're really thankful for that. So, Apostle John, I want to just really say thank you for your wisdom, for your life, just for your life of faithfulness to the Lord, and just for walking integrity. And we just honor you and all the sacrifices that you made for Jesus in the kingdom. And we really receive everything that you have shared today. So I just wanted to say thanks for being with us on the Be Transformed podcast. We're really honored to continue to get to know you and to build. Where can people find out more information about your ministry?
Probably the easiest way is to go to icaleaders.com.
ICAleaders.com.
Uh-huh.
Cool.
Go to
Check them out.
icaleaders.com. Then they'll really understand. They'll see everything there.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. I pray to God I wash your feet so you go the extra mile. You're a good man.
Thanks, man.